They left a folded lawn chair in the corner of the basement, right beside the water heater. Said it could be my new living room. No windows, just concrete walls and the hum of old pipes. I sat there that night, hands folded in my lap, the same way I used to sit at my own kitchen table before they moved in. Now the table was upstairs, and I was down here, with their leftover chair. I gave birth to the boy who gave me this chair. Before we continue, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Comment below. I've lived in this house for 43 years. Every brick, every floorboard has a story, some whispered between me and God, some still echoing with my husband's laughter. We moved here in 1982, fresh-faced and full of the kind of dreams only young love knows. It wasn't much, just a 2-story frame with faded green shutters and a porch that sagged in the middle. But it was ours. We painted it together, argued about the right shade of yellow for the kitchen, planted azaleas along the walkway. He carried me over the threshold, back when his knees still worked and my hair hadn't turned silver. The upstairs used to smell like cinnamon rolls on Saturdays. That was my husband's tradition. Baking, humming an old hymn while the dough rose. He'd kiss my cheek with flour still on his hands. We raised our son, Darren, right here in these rooms. His height marks are still carved on the pantry door, each line a memory. Back then, he used to wrap his arms around my waist and say, "You're the best mom in the world." Funny how those things drift away without a sound. Darren moved out after college, married a girl named Melanie. She was polite at first, always with a smile, but the kind that never quite reached her eyes. She liked everything in order. I noticed that early on, the way she straightened picture frames in other people's homes, or commented on dust like it was a moral failing. They had 2 children, Thomas and Lily, and when Darren got laid off from the insurance job, they asked if they could move in for a little while, just to get back on our feet. I said yes, of course. That's what mothers do. They moved into the upstairs guest room. It was supposed to be temporary, just until Darren found work again. I cleared space in the closet, boxed up my sewing to make room. They arrived with U-Haul trucks, furniture, boxes, even a treadmill they never used. Within weeks, the house started changing. My curtains came down, replaced with sleek blinds. The soft colors I'd chosen over decades gave way to grays and creams. My doilies disappeared from the side tables. No one asked. At first, I told myself it was okay, just small things. They cooked dinner sometimes, though they never liked what I made. Melanie said too much butter wasn't heart-healthy. She started cooking quinoa and kale, and the grandkids wrinkled their noses at my mashed potatoes. I began to feel like a guest in my own home. Even my chair, my blue rocker that faced the front window, was moved to the back porch to make space for the kids' play area. One day I found my photo albums stacked in a laundry basket in the garage, labeled Mom's Stuff. I held the top one in my lap, flipping through faded memories. My husband holding Darren as a baby. Christmas mornings with wrapping paper everywhere. Smiles that felt like a different lifetime. When I gently asked about the changes, Melanie smiled and said, "We're just refreshing the space a bit. It needed some updating." Darren said nothing. He just looked down at his phone, scrolling like the words coming out of my mouth didn't need answers. The little things grew into larger ones. They started using my bedroom bathroom, said the plumbing upstairs was unreliable. Then Melanie asked if I could make myself scarce on weekday mornings so she could do Zoom calls in peace. I began taking longer walks, sitting at the park, watching ducks float without concern. I started noticing my name wasn't on things anymore. The utility bills, the insurance, all in Darren's name now. He said it was just easier to consolidate. I nodded, even though a part of me wondered when that became the plan. And still, I tried to make it work. I bought little treats for the children, tucked blankets under their arms when they dozed on the couch. I cooked dinners and cleaned without complaint. But I could feel the air thinning, like the walls were slowly pushing me out. Melanie once joked during dinner, "It's nice having a built-in babysitter." I laughed politely, even though it didn't feel like a joke. Darren didn't look at me. He rarely did anymore. There was a quietness to my grief, not loud, not messy, just quiet. Like a room that used to be full of laughter now holding its breath. The basement had always been storage, old Christmas lights, my husband's fishing rods, tubs of outgrown toys, cold in the winter, damp in the summer. It had one small window high up, covered in leaves half the year. No one lived down there. No one ever should. Until one day, Melanie mentioned they were thinking of rearranging a bit. She used words like privacy and space for the kids' needs. I nodded, not fully understanding. Until Darren came to me, eyes avoiding mine, and said, "It might be good for everyone if you had your own space, downstairs." And just like that, without a single raised voice, I was moved below the life I built. They brought down a folding lawn chair, a cot, a little lamp from the attic. Said they'd spruce it up soon. That was 6 weeks ago. The stairs creak above me now, the ceiling echoing with footsteps. My room has no door, just the cold breath of the furnace. I sit here, sometimes holding my wedding ring in my palm, trying to remember the warmth of the man who built this place with his hands and his heart. And still, I whisper to myself, this is still my house. It started with the dishes. One morning I came upstairs and found a bright yellow post-it stuck to the sink. Please wash after use, not a maid service. The smiley face at the end felt crueler than the words. I hadn't left any dishes. I always cleaned up after myself. Always had. But I peeled the note off quietly, folded it in half, and tucked it into my pocket. I didn't say a word.
The next week, my tea canister was missing from the counter. I found it later in a plastic storage bin in the garage, along with my sugar jar and 2 of my floral mugs. The label on the bin said, "Extra kitchen stuff." Melanie was reorganizing, she said, trying to streamline the aesthetic. I smiled, a small one, and nodded. But inside, I felt the hollowness widening, like a thread pulled too tight. The children used to greet me with hugs. Thomas wrapping his arms around my knees, Lily pressing her cheek to my side. Now they passed me on the stairs like I was another piece of furniture. They didn't mean harm. They were just growing up under silence. When I did speak, they barely looked up from their screens. One evening, I made a pot of chicken noodle soup, the way I always had when Darren was a boy. I left it on the stove and called upstairs. No one came. Later, I found the pot rinsed and put away, untouched. The lights in the basement flickered sometimes. I asked Darren gently if he might look at the wiring. He mumbled that he'd get to it. That was 3 weeks ago. I've stopped asking. Even my mail came less frequently. One day, I noticed the mailbox was gone from the porch, replaced with a sleek, wall-mounted box I couldn't reach. Darren said they were just streamlining things again. He started bringing me my mail, already opened. I would hold the envelopes in my hand, the tears cleanly sliced across the top, and wonder when I stopped being allowed to open my own life. They didn't yell. They didn't push. They just moved me out of their way. On Sundays, they hosted friends from church, families in pressed shirts and bright dresses. I was never invited to join them at the table. I'd hear them laughing from below, the clinking of glasses, the scrape of chairs. Once, I came upstairs during one of those gatherings to get a book I'd left on the hall table. The room went quiet when they saw me. Melanie smiled too wide and said, "Oh, sorry. We didn't think you'd want to join. We weren't sure how tired you might be." That night, I cried for the first time since moving downstairs. Not loudly, not in anger, just a slow release, like rain falling into already soaked soil. There were new locks on the upstairs doors. I noticed it one afternoon when I tried to go into what used to be my sewing room. The doorknob turned halfway, then stopped. I stared at it for a long time. It used to be where I'd sit for hours, piecing together little quilts for the children when they were babies. Now it was Melanie's meditation space. She told me that when I asked, gently, why the door didn't open, she said it like it was hers, like it had always been hers. And Darren, my boy, my first and only, He hardly saw me anymore. He worked late, said little. When we crossed paths, his eyes flickered past me. There was always a reason, a call to take, a message to check. I would try sometimes to ask about his day, about the kids. He answered with one-word replies, walking down the hallway while I stood behind him in silence. I noticed, too, how things I loved kept vanishing. The framed photo of me and my husband on our anniversary, gone from the mantel. My blue Afghan, the one I'd knitted through the long winter after he died, folded into a bin in the basement. I didn't remember moving it. No one said anything. Then came the utilities. I asked about a charge I didn't recognize on the bank statement. Darren sighed, said they'd taken over the bills and not to worry about all that. I wasn't worried. I just wanted to understand. But my asking seemed to inconvenience him, like I'd broken an unspoken rule. The next month, I didn't see the statement at all. So I started keeping notes. Not out of suspicion, not then, just out of habit. The dates when something moved, when something changed. A little notebook I kept tucked into a hollow book on my basement shelf. My memory isn't what it used to be, but my heart remembers everything. Every act of exclusion was small, like a drip of water on stone. But even the softest drip, over time, carves through mountains. One evening, I found a pair of shoes in the basement stairwell. A child's sneakers, Lily's I think, tossed there carelessly. I picked them up, sat down on the step, and held them in my lap. They were muddy, worn. I used to wash those shoes once upon a time. I used to kiss scraped knees and braid small wiggling heads of hair. Now I lived beneath them, under their feet, under their laughter, under their plans. And still, I said nothing. Not yet. It started with the dishes. One morning I came upstairs and found a bright yellow post-it stuck to the sink. Please wash after use. Not a maid service. The smiley face at the end felt crueler than the words. I hadn't left any dishes. I always cleaned up after myself. Always had. But I peeled the note off quietly, folded it in half, and tucked it into my pocket. I didn't say a word. The next week, my tea canister was missing from the counter. I found it later in a plastic storage bin in the garage, along with my sugar jar and 2 of my floral mugs. The label on the bin said, "Extra kitchen stuff." Melanie was reorganizing, she said, trying to streamline the aesthetic. I smiled, a small one, and nodded. But inside, I felt the hollowness widening, like a thread pulled too tight. The children used to greet me with hugs, Thomas wrapping his arms around my knees, Lily pressing her cheek to my side. Now they passed me on the stairs like I was another piece of furniture. They didn't mean harm. They were just growing up under silence. When I did speak, they barely looked up from their screens. One evening, I made a pot of chicken noodle soup, the way I always had when Darren was a boy. I left it on the stove and called upstairs. No one came. Later, I found the pot rinsed and put away, untouched. The lights in the basement flickered sometimes. I asked Darren gently if he might look at the wiring. He mumbled that he'd get to it. That was 3 weeks ago. I've stopped asking. Even my mail came less frequently. One day, I noticed the mailbox was gone from the porch, replaced with a sleek, wall-mounted box I couldn't reach. Darren said they were just streamlining things again. He started bringing me my mail, already opened. I would hold the envelopes in my hand, the tears cleanly sliced across the top, and wonder when I stopped being allowed to open my own life. They didn't yell. They didn't push. They just moved me out of their way. On Sundays, they hosted friends from church, families in pressed shirts and bright dresses. I was never invited to join them at the table. I'd hear them laughing from below, the clinking of glasses, the scrape of chairs. Once, I came upstairs during one of those gatherings to get a book I'd left on the hall table. The room went quiet when they saw me. Melanie smiled too wide and said, "Oh, sorry, we didn't think you'd want to join. We weren't sure how tired you might be." That night, I cried for the first time since moving downstairs. Not loudly, not in anger, just a slow release, like rain falling into already soaked soil. There were new locks on the upstairs doors. I noticed it one afternoon when I tried to go into what used to be my sewing room. The doorknob turned halfway, then stopped. I stared at it for a long time. It used to be where I'd sit for hours, piecing together little quilts for the children when they were babies. Now it was Melanie's meditation space. She told me that when I asked, gently, why the door didn't open, she said it like it was hers, like it had always been hers. And Darren, my boy, my first and only, he hardly saw me anymore. He worked late, said little. When we crossed paths, his eyes flickered past me. There was always a reason, a call to take, a message to check. I would try sometimes to ask about his day, about the kids. He answered with one-word replies, walking down the hallway while I stood behind him in silence. I noticed, too, how things I loved kept vanishing. The framed photo of me and my husband on our anniversary, gone from the mantel. My blue Afghan, the one I'd knitted through the long winter after he died, folded into a bin in the basement. I didn't remember moving it. No one said anything. Then came the utilities. I asked about a charge I didn't recognize on the bank statement. Darren sighed, said they'd taken over the bills and not to worry about all that. I wasn't worried. I just wanted to understand. But my asking seemed to inconvenience him, like I'd broken an unspoken rule. The next month, I didn't see the statement at all, so I started keeping notes. Not out of suspicion, not then, just out of habit. The dates when something moved, when something changed. A little notebook I kept tucked into a hollow book on my basement shelf. My memory isn't what it used to be, but my heart remembers everything. Every act of exclusion was small, like a drip of water on stone. But even the softest drip, over time, carves through mountains. One evening, I found a pair of shoes in the basement stairwell. A child's sneakers, Lily's, I think, tossed there carelessly. I picked them up, sat down on the step, and held them in my lap. They were muddy, worn. I used to wash those shoes, once upon a time. I used to kiss scraped knees and braid small, wiggling heads of hair. Now I lived beneath them, under their feet, under their laughter, under their plans. And still, I said nothing. Not yet. The morning after that sleepless night, I made myself a cup of tea, not with the little bags Melanie kept in a tidy box upstairs, but with the loose chamomile I'd hidden behind a stack of old crossword books. I boiled the water on my little plug-in kettle, poured it into the thick mug I'd taken back from the extra kitchen stuff bin, and sat quietly on the stool near the water heater. I watched the steam rise, curling into the cold air of the basement like a soft ribbon, and thought, maybe this is where the climb begins. It wasn't a lightning bolt, no grand declaration, just a quiet turning, like a ship shifting its nose toward open water. I'd lived long enough to know when something had changed in me. That morning, I felt the first warmth of it, like spring waiting just behind the frost. After tea, I pulled out the little metal lockbox my husband used to keep tucked behind the furnace. He called it the essentials. Inside were old tax returns, copies of birth certificates, and, more importantly, the deed to the house. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges, but the names were still clear as daylight: James Allen Whitmore and Margaret Ann Whitmore. No mention of Darren, no Melanie. I held that paper in both hands like it was sacred. This house, this old, creaky, love-filled house, still had my name on it. I looked around me, at the cinder block walls, the worn cot, the chipped floor paint. They had taken the rooms. They had taken the upstairs. But they hadn't taken what mattered most. That realization was the first seed of strength. That afternoon, I took my cardigan from the hook and stepped outside. The air was crisp, but the sun was warm on my shoulders. I walked slowly down the sidewalk toward the public library. It had been years since I'd visited. The place smelled the same, like old books and quiet thinking. I asked the librarian, a soft-voiced woman named Angela, if she could help me use the computer. She smiled kindly and walked me through it. I searched for elder law attorneys in our town, wrote 3 names down in my small notebook, and thanked her. When I got back, I didn't mention anything to Darren or Melanie. I simply made myself a sandwich, peanut butter and strawberry jam, and returned downstairs without a word. It felt good, oddly. The not telling. The holding of something close to my chest. I began moving more slowly around them, not in speed, but in purpose. I listened when they thought I wasn't. I smiled when they spoke, but said little. I noticed things. How Melanie now left her laptop charger in my old bedroom, how Darren was always checking the mail before I could. I took note, but I didn't let it poison me. At night, I would sit with the deed on my lap and my husband's letter beside me. His handwriting, strong, unshaken, reminded me of who I used to be. You've built it with love, with patience, with the kind of strength people never see but always feel. Yes, yes, I had. One evening, Melanie came down to the basement. She knocked, not out of respect, I think, but more to give herself a moment before entering. She looked at the cot, the bare light bulb above my head, and sighed. We're thinking of converting this space a bit, she said. Maybe an office for Darren or a home gym. Would you mind moving to the garage for a while? I looked at her, long and slow, not angry, not even hurt, just quiet. I mind, I said. It was the first thing I'd said with weight in months. She blinked, surprised, then forced a smile. Well, we'll figure something out. I nodded once, turned back to my knitting. I didn't need to yell. She had heard me. Later that night, I pulled a clean sheet of paper from my notebook and began to write a list. Not of grievances, but of steps. Simple, calm steps. Call Mrs. Hensley, the second lawyer on my list. Gather all mail with financial information. Locate my birth certificate. Request updated copies of property taxes. Schedule appointment for next Tuesday. Each line was a breath. Each task a stitch in the quilt of my resolve. I slept that night, not fully, not deeply, but with something resembling rest. In the days that followed, I moved more like myself. I ironed my church blouse even though I didn't attend service. I walked to the post office and asked for a P.O. box, just for me. I transferred my Social Security check back into my own account, the one Darren had said was easier to consolidate. I didn't announce these things. I simply did them. Strength, I realized, doesn't always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it shows up in silence, in the quiet act of reclaiming what was always yours. They still walked above me, still laughed in the kitchen, still made plans as though I were invisible. But now, I saw everything. And more importantly, I remembered who I was. I was Margaret Ann Whitmore, wife of James, mother of Darren, owner of this house, and I was just getting started. Have you ever felt invisible in your own home? Let me know in the comments. There's something sacred about early morning light, the way it slips through even the smallest of windows. Down in the basement, I barely had one, but still, the light found its way in. A soft, stubborn beam pushing through the old window pane near the ceiling. It landed across the metal frame of my cot, then stretched toward my worn slippers by the wall. Every morning it reminded me, even in shadowed places, light will try to find you. It was under that faint warmth that I sat, with the deed open in front of me, and began to act. I called Mrs. Hensley from the library's quiet corner. She was the second name I'd written down, not the most reviewed, but something about her stood out. Her office had old-fashioned wallpaper and the scent of lemon polish. She reminded me of a schoolteacher, soft-spoken, but with a kind of steel in her eyes, the kind that didn't blink when things got uncomfortable. I told her everything, quietly, carefully. She didn't interrupt, just listened, one hand resting lightly on her notepad. When I finished, she folded her hands and said, "You still own the home, and you have every right to decide what happens next." The words landed like a balm in a bell. They soothed, but they also rang out something inside me, truth perhaps, long buried beneath other people's comfort. We spent an hour reviewing documents. I'd brought copies, carefully organized in a manila folder I kept hidden in an old cereal box in the basement. She pointed out next steps, asked clear questions. I answered each with steady breath. Before I left, she said gently, "You have more strength than you think." I nodded, but I didn't answer. Strength isn't something you boast about. It's something you carry. Over the next week, I kept moving. Small steps. I opened a new bank account in just my name. I visited the county clerk's office to request fresh property records. I updated my mailing address to the P.O. box, slowly rerouting each piece of my identity back into my own hands. Darren and Melanie didn't notice, not then. They were busy redecorating again. I heard them one afternoon through the floorboards, debating whether to knock down the wall between the dining room and kitchen. Melanie wanted an open concept, as if openness had anything to do with the way they lived. In the basement, I unfolded a cardboard box and began placing things inside. Not to leave, but to prepare. My photo albums, my grandmother's brooch, the letter from my husband, my original wedding license. Each item I packed wasn't just a possession. It was proof that I had been here, that I had mattered. I returned to Mrs. Hensley's office 2 more times. Each visit was quieter, more focused. By the third, she had drafted the listing paperwork. "If this is what you want," she said, placing the folder before me, "we can begin. The house is yours. No one else needs to sign a thing." I looked at the signature line, then at my hands, worn with years, but steady. I signed, not in anger, not in revenge, just in truth. They had offered me the basement. I was offering them a new address. On a rainy Thursday, I watched from the basement window as a real estate photographer circled the yard. Melanie was gone that day, her car missing from the driveway. Darren was in his home office, doors closed. The photographer worked quickly, discreetly, just as we'd planned. That night, they noticed the lock on the mailbox had changed. "Was someone messing with the mail?" Darren asked aloud during dinner. Melanie shrugged. "Maybe the wind?" I stirred my tea and said nothing. I'd learned that silence, when chosen, is far more powerful than silence forced. One morning, I came upstairs to find Melanie pacing in the kitchen, phone pressed to her ear. She didn't see me. Her voice was sharp, not angry, but urgent. "They're saying the house is listed. That can't be right. It's still ours." She paused, listened. Her back straightened. "No, it's in her name. But that doesn't mean, we live here." I turned away quietly, stepping back toward the basement door before she noticed me. I didn't need to hear the rest. The cracks had started showing. The next day, I met Mrs. Hensley at the local cafe. She brought the finalized documents, everything signed, everything legal. The house would close in 6 weeks. "You've done a brave thing," she said as she placed the papers gently into my bag. I nodded. Not in pride, but in peace. That afternoon, I made a pie, apple, with cinnamon and nutmeg, the way James used to love. I peeled each apple slowly, the way he taught me, letting the scent fill the small kitchen downstairs. As it baked, I sat at the table with a warm towel folded in my lap, hands resting, eyes closed. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt whole. It wasn't about the house, not really. It was about the space I'd taken back. Not just the rooms, but the right to be seen, to be heard, to be remembered not as a burden, but as a woman who still had say. The reckoning wasn't loud. It didn't come with slammed doors or raised voices. It came with papers and quiet plans, with folded clothes and manila folders, with dignity. That night, I stood at the base of the stairs and looked up, not to climb, not yet, but to see. They were still up there, still unaware, but the ground had shifted, and I was the one who moved it. It's strange how memory chooses its moments. You can go weeks without a thought, and then, in the middle of folding a sweater or peeling an apple, something rises, uninvited, unannounced, like dust in sunlight. That morning, it was the sound of a drawer sticking that brought it back. The silverware drawer upstairs always caught slightly. I'd told Darren about it years ago, back when he still listened. He'd said, "I'll fix it, Mom," but he never did. And just like that, I was back in another kitchen, another time, another silence. It was the day of James's funeral. I remember standing at the sink, staring out the small window over the backyard. The grass hadn't been mowed. I noticed that first. It was long, unruly, something James never would have let happen. He took pride in neat edges, in the hum of the mower on Saturday mornings. I could still hear it, even though he was gone. The house was full of people that day, but none of them spoke to me like I mattered. They offered condolences with the same rhythm they passed the casserole dishes. Darren had taken charge, moving through rooms like a host at someone else's party. Melanie followed close behind, always directing, always managing. "She's just tired," I heard her say when someone asked why I hadn't come to the living room. I wasn't tired. I was erased. I wanted to speak at the service, just a few words. I'd written something in a little notepad. Nothing dramatic, just memories. The way James used to whistle when he was nervous, how he always carried extra quarters for parking meters, even when we weren't driving anywhere. I wanted to say his name the way only I could, with a lifetime behind it. But when I approached Darren with the idea, he looked away. "We already planned everything," he said. "The pastor will handle it." Handle it. Like my husband was a task to be completed. I remember holding the notepad in my lap during the service, my fingers curled around the edge of the paper. I didn't speak. I wasn't asked. The pastor read a few generic verses. Melanie nodded at the right moments. Darren dabbed his eyes with the folded napkin from the program. No one said James's name the way I had planned. No one mentioned the way he once built me a birdhouse from scrap wood, or how he danced with me in the kitchen on our anniversary. Even when the music was only in our heads. After the guests left, I went to our bedroom alone. The bed was made, too neatly. I sat on the edge and placed the notepad in the drawer. I didn't cry then either. My tears had dried up during the week of decisions and papers and handshakes that weren't mine. That was the first time I felt what it was like to be left out of your own story. And now, years later, as I stood at the same kitchen drawer that stuck, the one Darren still hadn't fixed, I realized something important. They hadn't just stolen space. They'd stolen voice. Bit by bit. Moment by moment. It hadn't started with the basement. It started with that funeral. When a woman loses her husband, she's supposed to be held, to be heard. But I was shuffled aside, wrapped in silence, and told, "Don't worry, we've got it." I didn't want them to have it. I wanted to be part of it. That silence set the tone for everything that followed. When I asked about James's pension, Darren said he'd handle it. When I wanted to keep the old recliner, Melanie said it didn't match the decor. When I tried to tell stories to the grandkids, they were always interrupted by a tablet or homework or a phone call that never ended. It was always easier, it seemed, when I was quiet. But quiet wasn't who I used to be. Not really. I remembered then, a moment even farther back, years before the funeral. Darren had been in high school. He came home one afternoon with a scraped knee and angry eyes. He'd failed a math test, said the teacher didn't like him. I tried to comfort him, but he pulled away. "You don't get it," he snapped. "You're just home all day. Just home." Those words stung more than I let on. I'd spent years raising him, cooking, cleaning, stretching pennies into meals, waiting for James to come home safely from long shifts. And still, somehow, to my only son, I was just home. It wasn't his fault. He was young, but the echo of that moment lived in me. And it had grown louder over time. That small wound never fully healed, and it became easier to stay quiet than to keep defending a life they no longer saw as valuable. But in remembering, I also began to forgive myself. For staying silent too long. For shrinking to fit the corners they gave me. For letting them fold me like an old blanket and tuck me away. But now I was unfolding. Slowly. Carefully. I pulled the old notepad from my dresser drawer in the basement. The one with the words I never read at the funeral. The paper had curled, the ink slightly faded, but the words were still there. I read them aloud. Just once. in my voice, in my own space. It wasn't too late, and this time no one would silence me. It was a Tuesday morning when the real betrayal showed itself, not in words, not in whispers, but in ink. I'd gone upstairs to collect a parcel. A woman from the courier service had knocked twice and left it by the door, a plain brown envelope addressed to me, but with Darren's name scrawled beneath it. It didn't sit right with me. Something in the way it was written, rushed, slightly panicked. I brought it down to the basement and opened it carefully. Inside were a few sheets of paper stapled together. The top one read, "Notice of Mortgage Pre-Approval Borrowers, Darren Whitmore and Melanie Whitmore, co-signed by Margaret Whitmore, signature attached." I stared at that line for a long time, then longer, co-signed by Margaret Whitmore. My name, in cursive, neat, familiar, but wrong, because I had never signed anything. I touched the paper, that little loop in the G of Margaret. It looked like mine, almost perfectly, but it wasn't. It was like hearing your own voice in a recording you didn't make, a mimic of self, a stolen breath. I read further. They were applying for a mortgage, not for a new house, but to refinance this one, to consolidate debts. And they'd used my name to do it, my home, my ownership, without asking, without telling, without me. My heart didn't race. That surprised me. Instead, it slowed into something deeper, colder, like water freezing midstream. I felt the silence wrap around me, but this time, it wasn't suffocating. It was sharpening. I laid the papers down gently on the small table by my cot and turned on the lamp. The light flickered for a moment, then held steady. I reached for my notebook and wrote in small letters. They forged my name, not to shout it, not to react, just to acknowledge, to see it, to begin. I didn't confront them that night, or the next. I waited. I watched. I listened. 2 days later, I found Darren's laptop open on the dining table. I wasn't snooping, not exactly, just walking past when I saw the screen lit up. An email thread was open. The subject line read, "Home Equity Cash Out Process." The message was short. "Thanks, Janet. We'll move forward. She won't notice. She barely leaves the basement. We'll get her to sign the final doc this week. Shouldn't be a problem. She won't notice." That sentence did something to me. It broke something, but not in the way they expected. It didn't shatter me. It freed me. They had underestimated me, not just as a mother or a widow, but as a woman. They'd mistaken my quiet for absence, my silence for ignorance. They thought they were moving pieces around a board where I no longer played. But I was still here. I was watching. And now, I was done waiting. I printed the email, brought it to Mrs. Hensley along with the mortgage pre-approval. She read it slowly, jaw tightening, her pen resting against the margin. "This," she said softly, "is fraud. We'll take care of it." I nodded. My voice still calm, replied, "Quietly, please." The next week was filled with small, deliberate steps. Legal filings were submitted, protective orders drafted. The house listing, already in motion, was quietly updated with new conditions: owner occupied, not under dispute, legally authorized for sale. But in the house above me, nothing seemed different. Melanie still organized the pantry. Darren still worked in his office. The children still passed by like shadows. They didn't know the ground had shifted beneath them until the envelope came. It arrived one crisp morning, thick, cream-colored paper. Melanie found it first, standing at the mailbox in her bathrobe, coffee in hand. I watched from the basement window, the corner just low enough to see the front path. She opened it before stepping inside. I heard her voice rise, not in anger, in panic. "Darren!" They disappeared into the study. I heard drawers opening, papers shifting, footsteps back and forth. Then silence. That evening, they didn't speak to me. Darren passed me on the stairs, his eyes fixed on some far-off point, like if he didn't see me, I wasn't real. But I was real. I had always been real. They had taken my upstairs, my kitchen, my memories, but they could not take my name. And now they would learn my silence was never weakness, it was patience. I returned to the basement and lit the small candle I kept near my nightstand. It smelled of sandalwood, the last one James had bought me. I placed the forged papers next to it, then folded his letter over the top like a shield. You've built it with love. Don't ever let anyone take it from you. I hadn't, and I wouldn't. Not now. After the envelope came and the panic settled into the corners of the house, something changed, not in them, but in me. I stopped waiting for kindness, stopped listening for footsteps that might bring apology, stopped hoping that one morning Darren would knock softly on the basement door and say, "I'm sorry, Mom. We got lost in ourselves." No. That moment wasn't coming, and it no longer needed to. Because by then, I had already started to untangle myself, not from the house, but from the hope that they'd see me the way I used to be. They didn't speak to me much after the papers arrived. There were no more notes on the sink, no more tense smiles from Melanie when I walked past. Only quiet, the kind that used to feel heavy. Now it felt light, like something had lifted. I moved with purpose, slowly but surely. I stopped knocking before coming upstairs. If I needed tea, I made it. If I wanted to sit in the dining room, my dining room, I sat. I left the basement door open and let the light flow freely in and out. Once, I walked into the kitchen while Melanie was on a video call. She glanced up, startled, then quickly muted her microphone. "Oh, I thought you were downstairs," she said, like my presence was an interruption to a life she'd already redesigned without me. "I needed a cup," I said. That was all. I poured my tea. I stood tall. She said nothing else. I no longer apologized for taking up space, and I no longer waited to be invited. The children watched me differently now. Curious, unsure. Thomas asked if I could help with a school project, and for the first time in weeks, I said no. Not unkindly. Just no. I had other things to do. I folded my quilts one by one, placing them in cedar-lined boxes for the move. I labeled each carefully: James's chair cover, wedding ring blanket, Lily's baby quilt. Not for them, not anymore. For me, for memory, for the woman who stitched love into every inch. I called the moving company and arranged for a date. The woman on the phone asked if I needed help packing. I smiled and said, "No, thank you. I've been packing my heart for a long time. The rest is easy." In the quiet, I began reclaiming my rituals. I played music in the basement, soft old tunes James used to hum in the garage. I polished the silver I'd hidden after the funeral, wrapped each piece in linen. I opened my husband's old toolbox and oiled the hinges on the basement chest. No more sticking. I even baked a pie, cherry this time, and ate it warm with a single scoop of vanilla. I didn't share it. I didn't offer. I owed no one that anymore. It was around that time that Darren began hovering, not speaking, not engaging, just noticing. He stood longer near the basement stairs, like he was trying to read the movement beneath his feet. He opened the mail more slowly now, glancing up when I entered the room. One afternoon, I saw him holding the deed, the fresh copy Mrs. Hensley had mailed back to me, with my name printed bold and clear across the top. He folded it quickly when he saw me. I didn't ask what he thought. I didn't need to. The quiet had become mine now, not a prison, but a boundary, not a void, but a home. I cleaned out the kitchen pantry that week, threw away spices from 10 years ago, wiped the shelves until they smelled of lemon again. I placed my tea canister back on the counter, near the stove, right where it used to sit. When Melanie came in, she paused, eyes scanning the changes. "You've been busy," she said. I didn't stop wiping the counter, just reclaiming what's mine. She didn't answer, just nodded once and walked out. I slept better in those days, not because the cot got softer, but because the burden had gotten lighter. I had released the ache of being wanted, and in its place grew something steadier. Peace. I wasn't fighting. I wasn't proving. I wasn't pleading. I was simply living. In my home. In my truth. The for sale sign went up the following Monday. I watched them through the blinds, Darren standing in the driveway, staring at the sign like it had arrived by storm. Melanie paced inside, phone pressed to her ear again. But me? I sat in the rocker on the back porch, the one they'd banished there last spring, and I rocked slowly as the wind passed through the trees. I sipped my tea. I looked at the sky. I felt the weight of years settle, then lift, like dust finally laid to rest. They hadn't seen the shift. They didn't know when the balance had tipped. But I did. It wasn't loud. It wasn't grand. It was quiet. Like dignity. I found the diary on a Tuesday afternoon, tucked in the back of James's closet, behind an old shoebox full of screws and a faded Veterans Affairs pamphlet. It was mine, though I hadn't remembered writing so much. A little brown leather book with a loose spine, the kind with a thin strap that wraps around and tucks in tight. I'd used it once during the early years of our marriage, back when Darren was just a toddler and James worked nights at the plant. Back when I still talked to paper, before silence became the easier choice. I dusted it off and carried it down to the basement, the strap still curled neatly around the pages. It smelled of cedar and thyme, that old, sweet scent that lives in things we once treasured but forgot. I didn't read the whole thing in one sitting. Just a few lines, a few pages, each one a breadcrumb back to myself. June 12th, 1978. James fixed the fence today. Darren tried to help, but he mostly just threw dirt. I made lemonade. We sat on the back porch and didn't talk much, just smiled. I think silence like that is rare. The good kind. August 4th, 1983. I cried in the laundry room. No real reason. Just tired. James found me. Didn't ask why. He just sat beside me until the rinse cycle ended. That's love, I think. The kind that doesn't need to solve everything. November 9th, 1987. Darren called me old lady today and laughed. It was harmless, I know. But something in me paused. I don't ever want to become invisible. I want to always matter, even if only to myself. That last line, it stayed with me, even if only to myself. I read that entry 3 times, ran my fingers over the ink like it could reach across the years and shake my shoulder gently, reminding me that I had once known. I had always known. Deep down, I feared invisibility more than loneliness. I feared being reduced to background noise in the house I had built. And that's exactly what had happened. But now, I was finding my way back, and this diary. It felt like a rope tied to the version of me I'd buried. The woman who once demanded nothing but deserved everything. The woman who made meals stretch and love last. Who held space and hearts, even when her own felt small. That night, I placed the diary beside my bed, not hidden, not tucked away, but right there, where I could reach for it when needed. It wasn't just pages. It was proof that I had mattered long before anyone tried to make me feel otherwise. The next morning, I wrote in it again, first time in over 3 decades. March 10th, 2025. I remembered myself today, in bits and pages, and I think I am still here. I closed the diary slowly, the same way you hold a sleeping child, gentle, careful, full of reverence. And then, something unexpected happened. Lily came downstairs. She never did that. The children always stayed upstairs, floating in their digital worlds, their rooms echoing with the sounds of whatever was latest. But that afternoon, Lily appeared at the top of the basement stairs, her hair in a messy braid, holding something in her hands. "Grandma?" she called, uncertain. I turned. She looked nervous, almost shy. 11 years old and suddenly aware that I was more than a fixture in the floor beneath her feet. "I found this in the drawer," she said, holding out a photo frame. "Is it yours?" I reached for it slowly. It was a picture of me and James at our 25th anniversary. He was holding my hand, and I was laughing. My eyes were crinkled in the corners. Joy does that. Yes, I said quietly. It's mine. I thought it looked special, she said. Then softer. You look really happy in it. I was, I answered. I still am sometimes. She lingered there, unsure of whether to sit or run back to comfort. I pulled out a second chair, the old folding one they had given me months ago, and patted the seat. She came. We didn't talk much. I offered her a shortbread cookie from the tin I kept under the bed. She said thank you, and we sat there, side by side. I don't think she understood the depth of what was happening, but children know when something matters. She knew, and in that quiet moment, I saw the possibility of something small and sacred returning, a thread not yet broken. Later, I tucked the photo back into a new frame and placed it on the small table beside my bed, next to the candle, next to the diary. My altar of remembrance, my little corner of truth. That day, I didn't feel alone. Not just because Lily had come, but because I had found myself again, not in confrontation, not in legal papers, not in any big external moment, but in a diary I'd forgotten and a line I had written when I still wore ponytails and dreams, even if only to myself. I mattered. Then. Now. Always. The week the listing went public, things in the house got quiet. Not the peaceful kind, but the tense, suspended kind. Like a room full of people holding their breath at once, the kind of quiet that hums just beneath the skin. I could feel it in Darren's footsteps. He wasn't stomping or pacing, he was floating, moving from room to room like a man trying not to be seen. He was in and out of calls, hushed and clipped, the tone of someone scrambling to regain control without admitting they'd lost it. Melanie was worse. Not loud, never that. She preferred the sharpness of cold politeness. But now, even her small niceties had vanished. She no longer said hello, no longer asked me to move for her yoga mat. She simply stopped speaking to me altogether. I didn't mind. Silence had become my ally. One morning, I came upstairs to water the plants, the few they hadn't managed to kill or replace with plastic. My African violet still sat by the window, its blooms soft and steady, outlasting everything else. As I reached for the watering can, I heard Darren in the next room, phone pressed to his ear. Yes, I understand, he said, his voice tight. But we've lived here 5 years. Isn't there some kind of residency clause? A pause. Then, no, I didn't know the deed was never transferred. Another pause, longer. Well, what happens now? He didn't see me. I didn't move. I let his panic wash over me, not with joy, not with revenge, just with a quiet knowing. That's what truth does. It stands still while the rest of the world scrambles. That afternoon, a white envelope appeared under my door. No name, just tucked carefully, like a secret. I opened it to find a handwritten note from Darren, his writing still the same as when he used to label his lunch bag in grade school. Mom, can we talk? I think we all got carried away. Maybe we can come to an understanding. I folded the note once, then again. Set it on the table beside my diary. I didn't reply. They had never asked to talk before. Only when the walls began closing in. Only when the consequences knocked louder than their confidence. The next day, I sat on the front porch with my real estate agent, a kind woman named Evelyn, with silver streaks in her hair and a firm handshake. We reviewed final staging dates, walk-through times, and the open house schedule. She spoke with clarity and care, never once asking why the others were still living there. I just need you to know, she said as she passed me the clipboard. This is all perfectly above board. You've done everything right. I nodded. I know. She hesitated a moment, then smiled. The kind of smile women share when they understand things too heavy to put into words. From the porch, I could see Melanie standing inside the front room, arms crossed, watching us through the curtain. She didn't open the door. She didn't wave. I didn't mind. That evening, Lily came down again, this time with a notebook of her own. Grandma, she said softly, can you help me with my history project? It's about strong women in our family. Something in my chest pulled, not pain, not quite joy either. Just that aching in-between place where love still lives, even after disappointment. I said yes. We sat at the little table, flipping through old photos and newspaper clippings. She asked questions, took notes. When she read back one of the sentences she'd written, Margaret Whitmore raised her son and protected her home with quiet strength. I nearly lost my breath. She saw me. Even when the others tried not to, she did. Darren hovered near the basement door that night. I could hear his weight shifting, the stair creak just before a footstep begins. But he never came down. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he didn't know how to face the woman he'd underestimated. The day of the open house arrived. I stood in the living room, the one where James and I once danced with socks on wood floors, listening to Patsy Cline in the rain. The space had been cleaned, polished, lit with soft lamps. It looked beautiful, not because of staging, but because it was mine again. Fully. Finally. People came and went. Shoes lined the porch. Strangers smiled and murmured compliments. I didn't host. I didn't hover. I simply watched, from the porch, from the hall, like a woman witnessing her own freedom walk steadily toward her. Darren and Melanie stayed in their room. Doors closed. After the last visitor left, I walked through the room slowly, touching the walls one by one, whispering small goodbyes, not to the house, but to the parts of me that had once asked permission to be seen. Now the consequences were settling like dust after a storm, and I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clean. They had gambled on my silence. They didn't expect I'd bet on myself. It wasn't planned. No appointment circled on a calendar, no words rehearsed in the mirror. Just one soft afternoon, full of spring air and windows cracked open, when the right moment finally came, not with a knock, but with a silence too thick to ignore. Darren stood in the kitchen, alone, his shoulders slumped, arms resting on the counter. I could see the weight in the way he leaned, not physical, but emotional. Like a man trying to hold up a house he finally realized wasn't his. I stepped into the room, slow and certain. The floor beneath me didn't creak. The sun cast long lines across the tile, catching the silver in my hair. He didn't look at me at first, just stared down at his hands. When he did, his eyes were tired. Not red, not puffy, just worn. The look of someone who'd run too far in the wrong direction and only now checked the map. "Mom," he started, voice softer than I remembered. I don't know what to say. I waited. I let the quiet fill the space between us. Not to punish, just to give truth the time it needed to settle. "I didn't mean for it to go this way," he said. "We were just overwhelmed. And then things got messy." Melanie said, I raised one hand, gentle but firm. "You don't need to explain her," I said. "Not anymore." He stopped. His mouth opened, then closed again. I stepped closer, resting one hand on the edge of the table, the same table where I'd once fed him oatmeal with brown sugar, where I'd sewn his Halloween costumes, where I'd read letters from his teachers with pride. "This house," I began, "was built with more than wood. It was built with sacrifice, with years of holding things together even when they were falling apart." He nodded, eyes lowered. "And I welcomed you back," I continued, "not as a burden, but as a gift. I thought maybe family meant something steady, something sacred." The air in the kitchen grew still. The wind outside rustled the leaves like someone flipping pages too fast. "You were my child," I said, softer now. "And I was still your mother, but somewhere along the way, you forgot." He swallowed hard. "I didn't mean to." "I know," I interrupted gently. "But you did." A long pause stretched between us. Then I stepped back, lifting the small envelope I had tucked under my arm. I placed it on the table. "The house is sold. We close in 3 weeks." He stared at it like it might disappear if he blinked hard enough. "You'll need to find another place," I said. I've arranged for a moving service. They'll come next Monday. His face fell, but I saw no anger, just acceptance. A slow, heavy understanding. Mom, where will you go? I looked past him, through the window, to the light brushing against the back porch, where my rocker sat, my teacup still on the table from the morning. I found a place, I said. A little apartment, sunlight in the mornings. Quiet. Enough space for my things, and a chair for anyone who visits with kindness. He didn't speak, just nodded. I'm not angry, I added. I'm not here to shame you. He finally looked at me. Then why now? Why all of this? I let the words sit on my tongue for a second before speaking. Because I remember who I am, I said, and I won't live in the basement of my own life. The kitchen fell quiet again, but this time it didn't feel heavy. It felt like truth. I turned to leave, my slippers soft on the tile. At the doorway, I paused. You're still my son, I said, without turning. But now, I am also my own. Later that evening, I heard boxes shifting upstairs, the sound of drawers opening, the soft shuffle of change beginning. I didn't need to watch. I just sat in my rocker, wrapped in one of my quilts, the diary resting on my lap. The confrontation wasn't fire. It was calm. It wasn't loud. It was final. And I, at last, was whole. The last morning I spent in the house was quiet. The kind of quiet I used to long for in the early years of motherhood. No footsteps overhead, no clattering of dishes I didn't touch. Just birdsong through the kitchen window and the hum of the fridge, still working, still reliable. I moved slowly through the rooms, touching the edges of things for the last time. The walls, the banister, the narrow hallway that used to echo with Darren's childhood laughter. The sun poured in, like it knew I was saying goodbye. Not just to the house, but to who I'd been inside it. A moving truck was parked neatly along the curb. The men were kind, respectful. They didn't rush me. They called me ma'am and handled my things with care. My rocker, my quilts, my boxes of memory, they packed them gently like they understood what those things meant. I didn't bring much, just what was mine, just what still felt like home. My new apartment was smaller, a tidy second-floor unit in a quiet senior complex near the park. It had pale blue walls, wide windows, and a tiny balcony, just big enough for a chair and 2 flower pots. The rent came from my own account, the key turned in my own hand. And for the first time in years, I opened a door that belonged only to me. The first thing I unpacked was the framed photo of me and James. I placed it on the dresser by the window, then my diary, set gently on the bedside table. I put the kettle on. It hissed softly, like it had missed me. I brewed a cup of tea, chamomile, from my own stash, and sat by the window, watching the world move without me needing to chase it. There was peace in that, not excitement, not relief, just peace. Later that week, I joined a small knitting group at the community center. They welcomed me with warm smiles and soft conversation. One woman, Ruth, reminded me of an old neighbor I used to know. She had kind eyes and crooked hands, and we spoke about patterns and yarn like it was a secret language. Nobody asked why I'd moved, and I didn't offer. Some things don't need telling right away. I found new rhythm in those days, morning walks under soft trees, crossword puzzles with coffee, letters written by hand, not to Darren, but to myself. Notes of where I'd been, what I'd felt, what I never wanted to forget again. One day, a package arrived at my door. No return address, just my name written in familiar print. Inside was a small envelope with a folded card. Mom, it read, I hope you're well. The house feels different without you. I've been thinking a lot. About everything. Lily misses you? I do too. I hope we can talk sometime if you're willing. No promises, no excuses. Just the smallest door opened. I placed the card in the drawer beside the diary. Not to forget, just to hold gently. Maybe one day. But not today, because today I was whole. I hung wind chimes on the balcony, soft silver ones that tinkled with the afternoon breeze. I planted 2 geraniums, red and bright, like little bursts of memory that refused to wilt, and I rocked, not in sorrow, not in waiting, but in presence. I looked out at the trees and the light through the leaves and thought about the life I had reclaimed, not because anyone handed it back, but because I finally reached for it myself. There had been heartbreak. Yes, but there had also been healing. There had been betrayal, but now there was beginning. I wasn't just free from the basement, I was home, in my own name, in my own time, in my own way. And for the first time in years, I belonged completely to myself. The last morning I spent in the house was quiet, the kind of quiet I used to long for in the early years of motherhood. No footsteps overhead, no clattering of dishes I didn't touch, just birdsong through the kitchen window and the hum of the fridge, still working, still reliable. I moved slowly through the rooms, touching the edges of things for the last time. The walls, the banister, the narrow hallway that used to echo with Darren's childhood laughter. The sun poured in like it knew I was saying goodbye, not just to the house, but to who I'd been inside it. A moving truck was parked neatly along the curb. The men were kind, respectful. They didn't rush me. They called me ma'am and handled my things with care. My rocker, my quilts, my boxes of memory. They packed them gently, like they understood what those things meant. I didn't bring much, just what was mine, just what still felt like home. My new apartment was smaller, a tidy second-floor unit in a quiet senior complex near the park. It had pale blue walls, wide windows, and a tiny balcony just big enough for a chair and 2 flower pots. The rent came from my own account, the key turned in my own hand. And for the first time in years, I opened a door that belonged only to me. The first thing I unpacked was the framed photo of me and James. I placed it on the dresser by the window, then my diary, set gently on the bedside table. I put the kettle on. It hissed softly, like it had missed me. I brewed a cup of tea, chamomile, from my own stash, and sat by the window, watching the world move without me needing to chase it. There was peace in that. Not excitement, not relief, just peace. Later that week, I joined a small knitting group at the community center. They welcomed me with warm smiles and soft conversation. One woman, Ruth, reminded me of an old neighbor I used to know. She had kind eyes and crooked hands, and we spoke about patterns and yarn like it was a secret language. Nobody asked why I'd moved, and I didn't offer. Some things don't need telling right away. I found new rhythm in those days. Morning walks under soft trees, crossword puzzles with coffee, letters written by hand, not to Darren, but to myself. Notes of where I'd been, what I'd felt, what I never wanted to forget again. One day, a package arrived at my door. No return address, just my name written in familiar print. Inside was a small envelope with a folded card. Mom, it read, I hope you're well. The house feels different without you. I've been thinking a lot. About everything. Lily misses you. I do too. I hope we can talk sometime if you're willing. No promises. No excuses. Just the smallest door opened. I placed the card in the drawer beside the diary. Not to forget, just to hold gently. Maybe one day. But not today. Because today, I was whole. I hung wind chimes on the balcony, soft silver ones that tinkled with the afternoon breeze. I planted 2 geraniums, red and bright, like little bursts of memory that refused to wilt, and I rocked. Not in sorrow, not in waiting, but in presence. I looked out at the trees and the light through the leaves and thought about the life I had reclaimed, not because anyone handed it back, but because I finally reached for it myself. There had been heartbreak, yes, but there had also been healing. There had been betrayal. But now, there was beginning. I wasn't just free from the basement. I was home, in my own name, in my own time, in my own way. And for the first time in years, I belonged completely to myself. Some mornings now, I sit on my little balcony and let the light warm my knees. I sip my tea, knit a few quiet rows, and smile at the sound of life drifting up from the street below. Children laughing, dogs barking, wind weaving through leaves like it's telling secrets only the trees can keep. I think about the basement sometimes. Not with bitterness, but with clarity. I remember how cold it felt, how still, how I sat in that folding chair and told myself to endure. And I think about the turning, the moment I chose not to wait for kindness, but to create it for myself. There's a strength that comes from silence, from the long road of being overlooked and yet still seeing clearly. It doesn't roar, it doesn't shout, it just rises, one steady breath at a time. The truth is, they never really saw me, not as I was, but I do. And now, in this small apartment with the wind chimes on the rail and my name on the lease, I live each day with a peace that isn't borrowed or negotiated. It's mine. My story isn't about revenge, it's about return, to myself, to dignity, to the woman who once whispered, even if only to myself, I matter. And I do. So do you. If you've ever felt unseen or forgotten, remember, your worth doesn't depend on their understanding. You don't need their permission to stand tall. You were always enough. You still are. If you've ever felt forgotten or unseen, you're not alone. Share your story in the comments. Someone out there might need to hear it. When I first moved into this apartment, I didn't know what quiet joy sounded like. I had forgotten what it meant to sit in a room and feel no tension in my chest, no weight pressing down on my voice. But now, each morning brings me that reminder, in the way the sunlight rests gently on the table, in the way my kettle hums without rush, in the simple grace of being alone, and not lonely. Sometimes I still hear their voices in memory, Darren calling from the hallway, Lily's laughter on the stairs. But those sounds no longer sting. They're folded neatly in the past, like a worn quilt I no longer sleep under. I've started writing again, not just in my old diary, but on blank pages meant for new beginnings. I write about what I've learned, that dignity can live in silence, that strength often walks barefoot, and that reclaiming your life doesn't always come with applause. It comes with soft mornings, with standing when no one's watching, with saying, I am still here. And I am. I no longer live in the shadows of my own story. I no longer wait for someone to see me. I have become my own witness, my own keeper, my own quiet triumph. The house is gone. The basement, the stairs, the rooms that once held me, they belong to someone else now. But my life, it finally belongs to me. So if you're sitting in your own kind of basement, waiting, hoping, hurting, let this be your light. You are not too late, you are not too small, and you are never, ever beyond beginning again. If you've ever felt forgotten or unseen, you're not alone. Share your story in the comments. Someone out there might need to hear it.